it's hardly a secret that the terms of political discourse are not exactly models of precision. And considering the way terms are used, it's next to impossible to try to give a meaningful answer to such questions as what is socialism, or what is capitalism, or what are markets, free markets, and many others in common usage. And that's even more true of the term anarchism, for reasons that Nathan pointed out. It's been not only subject to very varied use, but also a quite extreme abuse, sometimes by bitter enemies, sometimes, unfortunately, by people who hold its manner high. So much is the variation and abuse that it resists any simple characterization. In fact, the only way I can see to address the question that's posed this evening, what is anarchism, is to try to identify some leading ideas that animate at least major currents of the rich and complex and often contradictory traditions of anarchist thought and, crucially, anarchist action. Well, I think a sensible approach can start with remarks by the perceptive, important anarchist intellectual and also activist Rudolf Rocker. I'll quote him. He saw anarchism not as a fixed, self-enclosed social system with a fixed answer to all the multifarious questions and problems of human life, but rather as a definite trend in the historic development of mankind, which strives for the free, unhindered unfolding of all the individual and social forces in life. It's from the 1930s. These concepts are not really original. They derive from the Enlightenment and the early Romantic period. In rather similar words, Wilhelm von Humboldt, one of the founders of classical liberalism, among many other achievements, described the leading principle of his thought as the absolute and essential importance of human development in its richest diversity. That's a phrase that John Stuart Mill took as the epigraph to his On Liberty. It follows from that that institutions that constrain such human development are illegitimate, unless, of course, they can somehow justify themselves. You find a similar conception widely in Enlightenment thought. So, for example, in Adam Smith, everyone has read the opening paragraphs of Wealth of Nations, where he extols the wonders of division of labor, but not many people have gotten farther inside to read his bitter condemnation of division of labor and his insistence that in any civilized society the government will have to intervene to prevent it because it will destroy personal integrity and essential human rights, will turn people, he said, into creatures as stupid and ignorant as a human can be. It's not too easy to find that passage, whatever the reason may be. If you look in the standard scholarly edition, the University of Chicago bicentennial edition, it's not even listed in the index. Well, but it's one of the most important passages in the book. Looked at in these terms, anarchism is a tendency in human development that seeks to identify structures of hierarchy, domination, authority, and others that constrain human development. And then it seeks to subject them to a very reasonable challenge. Justify yourself. Demonstrate that you're legitimate. And maybe in some special circumstances or conceivably in principle. And if you can't meet that challenge, which is the usual case, the structure should be dismantled. And as Nathan rightly adds, not just dismantled, but reconstructed from below. The ideals that found expression during the Enlightenment and the Romantic era, they foundered on the shoals of rising industrial capitalism which is completely antithetical to them. But Rocker argues, I think quite plausibly, that they remain alive in the libertarian socialist traditions. These range pretty widely. They range from left anti-Bolshevik Marxism, that's people like Anton Pannekoek, Karl Korsch, Paul Matic, and others, including the anarcho-syndicalism that reached its peak of achievement in the revolutionary period in Spain in 1936. And it's well to remember that despite its substantial achievements and successes, it was crushed by the combined force of fascism, communism, and Western democracy. They had differences, but they agreed that this had to be crushed. The effort of free people to control their own lives, that had to be crushed before they turned to their petty differences, which we call the Spanish Civil War. The same tendencies reach further to worker-controlled enterprises. They're springing up in large parts of the old Rust Belt in the United States, in northern Mexico. They've reached their greatest development in the Basque Country in Spain. Mondragon is partly a reflection of the achievements of the long, complex, and rich Spanish tradition of anarchism. And partly it comes out of Christian anarchist sources. There's also included in this general tendency are the quite substantial and cooperative movements that exist in many parts of the world. And I think it also encompasses at least a good part of feminist and human rights activism. Well, in part, all of this sounds like truism. So why should anyone defend illegitimate structures? No reason, of course. And I think that perception's correct. It really is truism. I think anarchism is basically ought to be called truism. But truisms have some merit. One of them is the merit of being true, unlike most political discourse. And this particular truism belongs to an interesting category of principles. Principles that are not only universal, but doubly universal. They're universal in that they're almost universally accepted, and universal in that they're almost universally rejected in practice. And this is there are many of these. For example, the general principle that we should apply to ourselves the same standards we do to others, if not harsher ones. A few would object, a few would practice it. Or more specific policy proposals like democracy promotion or humanitarian intervention, professed, generally rejected in practice almost universally, all doubly universal. And this truism is the same, the truism that we should challenge and coercive institutions of all kinds, demand that they justify themselves, dismantle and reconstruct them if they do not. Easy to say, but not so easy to act on in practice. Well, proceeding with similar thoughts, I'll quote Rocker again. Anarchism seeks to free labor from economic exploitation and to free society from ecclesiastical or political guardianship. And by doing that, opening the way to an alliance of free groups of men and women based on cooperative labor and a planned administration of things in the interest of the community. Now, Rocker was an anarchist activist as well as political thinker, and he goes on to call on the workers' organizations, other popular organizations, to create, I'm quoting, not only the ideas, but also the facts of the future itself within the current society. That's an injunction that goes back to Bakunin. One traditional anarchist slogan is ni Dieu ni maître, no God, no master. It's a phrase that Daniel Guérin took as a title of his very valuable collection of anarchist classics. I think it's fair to understand the phrase no God in the terms that I just quoted from Rocker. Opposition to ecclesiastical guardianship. Individual beliefs are a different matter. That's no matter of concern to a person concerned with free development of thought and action. And that leaves the door open to the lively and impressive tradition of religious anarchism. For example, Dorothy Day's very impressive Catholic workers' movement. But the phrase "no master" is different. That refers not to individual belief, but to a social relation, a relation of subordination and dominance, a relation that anarchism, if taken seriously, seeks to dismantle and rebuild from below, unless it can somehow meet the harsh burden of establishing its legitimacy. Well, by now we've departed from truism, in fact, to ample controversy. In particular, right at this point, the rather peculiar American brand of what's called libertarianism departs very sharply from the libertarian tradition. It accepts and indeed strongly advocates the subordination of working people to the masters of the economy, and furthermore the subjection of everyone to the restrictive discipline and destructive features of markets. Now, these are topics worth pursuing. I'll take them up later if you'd like, but I'll put them aside here, though also recommending to you Nathan's comment, his suggestion about bringing together in some way the energies of the young libertarian left and right, as is indeed sometimes done. For example, it's done in the quite important work of valuable theoretical and practical work of economist David Ellerman and some others. Well, anarchism, of course, is famously opposed to the state, while at the same time advocating planned administration of things in the interests of the community, Rocker's phrase again. And beyond that, broader federations of self-governing communities, workplaces. Well, in the real world of today, the same dedicated anarchists who are opposed to the state often support state power to protect people and society and the earth itself from the ravages of concentrated private capital. So take, say, a venerable anarchist journal like Freedom. Goes back to 1886, formed as a journal of socialist anarchism by supporters of Kropotkin. If you open its pages, you'll find that much of it is devoted to defending rights of people, the environment, society, often by invoking state power, like regulation of the environment or safety and health regulations in the workplace. There's no contradiction here, as sometimes thought. People live and suffer and endure in this world, and not some world that we imagine. And all the means available should be used to safeguard and benefit them, even if the long-term goal is to displace these devices and construct preferable alternatives. In discussing this, I've sometimes used an image that comes from the Brazilian workers' movement. It's discussed in interesting work by Bjorn Maybury Lewis. They speak of, they use the image of widening the floors of the cage. The cage is existing coercive institutions that can be widened by committed popular struggle, happened effectively over many years. And you can extend the image beyond. Think of the cage of coercive state institutions as a kind of protection from savage beasts that are roaming outside, namely the predatory, state-supported capitalist institutions that are dedicated to the principle of private gain, power, domination, with the interest of the community at most a footnote, maybe revered in rhetoric, but dismissed in practice and, in fact, even in Anglo-American law. Well, it's also worth remembering that anarchists condemned really existing states, not visions of unrealized democratic dreams, such as government of, by, and for the people. They bitterly opposed the rule of what Bakunin had called the red bureaucracy, which he predicted 50 years in advance would be among the most savage of human creations. And they also opposed parliamentary systems that are instruments of class rule. The contemporary United States, for example, which is not a democracy, it's a plutocracy. It's very easy to demonstrate. The majority of the population has no influence over policy. And as you move up the income wealth scale, you get more and more influence. The very top people get what they want. Well established by academic political science, but familiar to everyone who looks at the way the world works. A truly democratic system would be quite different. It would have the character of, quote again, an alliance of free groups of men and women based on cooperative labor and a planned administration of things in the interests of the community. In fact, that's not too remote from one version of the mainstream democratic ideal. Actually, one version. I stress that. I'll return to others. So take, for example, the leading American social philosopher of the 20th century, John Dewey. His major concerns were democracy and education. No one took Dewey to be an anarchist. But pay attention to his ideas. In his conception of democracy, illegitimate structures of coercion must be dismantled. And that includes, I'll quote him, domination by business for private profit through private control of banking, land, industry, reinforced by command of the press, press agents, other means of publicity and propaganda. He recognized, still quoting, that power today resides in control of the means of production, exchange, publicity, transportation, and communication. Whoever owns them rules the life of the country, even if democratic forms remain. And until these institutions are in the hands of the public, politics will remain the shadow cast by big business on society. Very much what we see around us, in fact. But it's important that Dewey went beyond calling for some form of public control. That could take many forms. He went beyond. In a free and democratic society, he wrote, workers should be the masters of their own industrial fate, not tools rented by employers, not directed by state authorities. Now that position goes right back to the leading ideas of classical liberalism articulated by von Humboldt, Smith, others, and extended in the anarchist tradition. Turning to education, Dewey held that it is illiberal and immoral to train children to work not freely and intelligently, but for the sake of the work earned, to achieve test scores, for example, in which case their activity is not free because it's not freely participated in. And it's quickly forgotten, too, as all of us know from our experience. So he proceeded to conclude that industry must be changed from a feudalistic to a democratic social order, and educational practice should be designed to encourage creativity, exploration, independence, cooperative work. Exactly the opposite of what's happening today. Well, these ideas lead to a vision of society based on workers' control of productive institutions, linked to community control within the framework of free association and federal organization, in the general style of thought that includes, of course, along with many anarchists, others too, say G.D.H. Cole's Guild Socialism, England, left anti-Bolshevik Marxism, current developments, such as, for example, the participatory economics and politics of Michael Albert, Robin Hanel, Stephen Shalom, and others, along with important work in theory and practice by the late Seymour Melman, his associates, and many others, and notably Gar Alperovitz's very valuable recent contributions on worker-owned enterprise and cooperatives, not just talk, but actual taking place. Well, going back to Dewey, he was as American as apple pie, to borrow the old cliche, right in the mainstream of American history and culture. And in fact, all of these ideas and developments are very deeply rooted in the American tradition and in American history, a fact which is kind of suppressed, but is very, very obvious when you look into it. And when you pursue these questions, you enter into an important terrain of inspiring, often bitter struggle that's ever since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, which was right around here, Lowell, Lawrence, eastern Massachusetts, mid-19th century. The first serious scholarly work, study of the industrial worker in those years, was 90 years ago. It's by Norman Ware, still very much worth reading. He reviews the hideous working conditions that were imposed on formerly independent craftsmen and immigrants and farmers, as well as the so-called factory girls, young women brought from the farms to work in the textile mills around Boston. He mentions that, he reviews it, but he focuses attention on something else, on what he calls the degradation suffered by the industrial worker, the loss of status and independence, which could not be canceled, even where there occasionally was some material improvement. And he focuses on the radical capitalist social revolution in which sovereignty in economic affairs passed from the community as a whole into the keeping of a special class of masters, often remote from production, a group alien to the producers. And Ware shows, I think pretty convincingly, that for every protest against machine industry and privation, there can be found 100 protests against the new power of capitalist production and its discipline. In other words, workers were struggling and striking not just for bread, but for roses, in the traditional slogan of the workers' communities and organizations. They were struggling for dignity and independence, for their rights as free men and women. And their journals are very interesting. There's a rich and lively labor press written by working people, artisans from Boston, factory girls from the farms. In these journals, they condemned what they called the blasting influence of monarchical principles on democratic soil, which will not be overcome until they who work in the mills will own them, the slogan of the massive Knights of Labor, and sovereignty will return to free and independent producers. Then they will no longer be menials or the humble subjects of a foreign despot, the absentee owner, slaves in the strictest sense of the word, who toil for their masters. Rather, they will regain their status as free American citizens. The capitalist revolution instituted a crucial change from price to wage. It's very important. When a producer sold his product for a price, he retained his person. But when he came to sell his labor, he sold himself. I'm quoting from the press. That's a big difference. He lost his dignity as a person as he became a slave, a wage slave, to use the common term of the period. 160 years ago, a group of skilled workers repeated the common view that a daily wage was equivalent to slavery, and they warned perceptively that a day might come when wage slaves will so far forget what is due to manhood as to glory in a system forced on them by their necessity and in opposition to their feelings of independence and self-respect. a day that they hoped would be far distant. These were very popular notions in the mid-19th century. In fact, so popular that they were a slogan of the Republican Party. You could read them in editorials of the New York Times. That's then, not now, but that day may come back, let's hope. Labor activists at the time warned bitterly often of what they called the new spirit of the age, gain wealth forgetting all but self. That was a new spirit of the age 150 years ago. And in sharp reaction to this demeaning spirit, there were quite enormous and active rising movements of working people and radical farmers. Radical farmers actually began in Texas, spread through the Midwest and much of the country. It was, of course, an agricultural country then. These are the most significant democratic popular movements in American history. They were dedicated to solidarity, mutual aid. It's a battle. They were crushed by force. We have a very violent labor history as compared with other countries. But it's a battle that's not over, far from over, despite setbacks, often violent repression. Well, there are apologists, familiar apologists for the radical revolution of wage slavery, and they have an argument. They argue that the worker should indeed glory in a system of free contracts voluntarily undertaken. There was an answer to that 200 years ago by Shelley in his great poem, Mask of Anarchy. This was written right after the Peterloo massacre in England, Manchester, when British cavalry brutally attacked a peaceful gathering of tens of thousands of people, the first major example of huge nonviolent protest and the reaction of the state authorities to it. They were calling for parliamentary reform. So Shelley wrote that we know what slavery is. 'Tis to work and have such pay as just keeps life from day to day, in your limbs as in a cell for the tyrant's use to dwell. 'Tis to be slave in soul and to hold no strong control over your own wills, but be all that others make of ye. That's slavery. That's what working people and independent farmers were struggling against. And the artisans and factory girls who struggled for dignity and independence and freedom might very well have known Shelley's words. Observers at the time noted that they were highly literate. They had good libraries. They were acquainted with the standard works of English literature. This is before mechanism and wage slavery, the wage system, ended the days of, at least curtailed the days of independence, high culture, and security. Before that, Ware points out, a workshop might be what he called a lyceum. Journeymen would hire boys to read to them while they worked. These were social businesses with many opportunities for reading, discussion, mutual improvement. Along with the factory girls, the journeymen, the artisans, bitterly condemned the attack on their culture. The same was true in England, incidentally, where conditions were much harsher. There's actually a great book about this by Jonathan Rose called The Intellectual Life of the British Working Class. It's a monumental study of the reading habits of the working class of what we think of as Dickensian England. And he contrasts what he calls the passionate pursuit of knowledge by proletarian autodidacts with the pervasive philistinism of the British aristocracy. Actually, I'm old enough to remember residues that remained among working people right here in New York in the 1930s who were deeply immersed in the high culture of the day. It's another battle that may have receded, but I don't think it's lost. Well, I mentioned that Dewey and American workers and farmers held one version of democracy with very strong libertarian elements. But the dominant version has been radically different. Its most instructive expression is at the progressive end of the spectrum, mainstream spectrum. So that is among people who are good Woodrow Wilson, FDR, Kennedy liberals. Here's a few representative quotes from icons of the liberal intellectual establishment on democratic theory. The public are ignorant and meddlesome outsiders. They have to be put in their place. Decisions must be in the hands of an intelligent minority of responsible men, namely us. And we have to be protected from the trampling and roar of the bewildered herd out there. The herd does have a function in a democratic society. They're supposed to lend their weight every few years to a choice among the responsible men. But apart from that, their function is to be spectators, not participants in action. And all of this is for their own good. We should not succumb to democratic dogmatisms about men being the best judges of their own interests. They're not. They're like young children. You have to take care of them. We're the best judges of their own interests. So their attitudes and opinions have to be controlled for their own benefit. We have to regiment their minds the way an army regiments bodies. And we have to discipline the institutions responsible for what they called the indoctrination of the young, schools, universities, churches. If we can do this, we can get back to the good old days. This is complaints about the 60s. We can get back to the good old days when Truman had been able to govern the country with the cooperation of a relatively small number of Wall Street lawyers and bankers, and then we'll have true democracy. Now, these are quotes from icons of the liberal establishment. Walter Lippmann, Edward Bernays, Harold Lasswell, founder of modern political science, Samuel Huntington, Trilateral Commission, which largely staffed the Carter administration. Well, the conflict between these conceptions of democracy goes far back, goes back to the earliest modern democratic revolution in 17th century England. That time, as you know, there was a war raging between supporters of the king and supporters of Parliament. That's the Civil War that we read about. But there was more. The gentry, the men who called themselves the men of best quality, they were appalled by the rabble who didn't want to be ruled by either king or Parliament, like the Spanish workers in 1936, neither side. They wanted to be ruled as they had their own pamphlet literature, and they said they wanted to be ruled by countrymen like ourselves that know our wants. It will never be a good world while knights and gentlemen make us laws that are chosen for fear and do but oppress us and do not know the people's sores. That's 17th century England. The essential nature of this conflict, which is far from ended, was captured nicely by Thomas Jefferson in his later years when he had serious concerns about both the quality and the fate of the democratic experiment. He made a distinction between what he called aristocrats and democrats. The aristocrats, I'm quoting him, are those who fear and distrust the people and wish to draw all powers from them into the hands of the higher classes. The Democrats, in contrast, identify with the people, have confidence in them, cherish and consider them as the honest and safe, although not the most wise, depository of the public interest. The modern progressive intellectuals, the Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy intellectual left, those who seek to put the public in their place and are free from democratic dogmatisms about the capacity of the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders to enter the political arena, they're Jefferson's aristocrats. These basic views are very widely held, though there are some disputes, namely who should play the guiding role. Should it be what the liberal intellectuals call the technocratic and policy-oriented intellectuals, the ones we celebrate as the Camelot intellectuals, who run the Progressive Knowledge Society. Should it be bankers or corporate executives? In other versions, should it be the Central Committee or the Guardian Council of Clerics? All pretty similar ideas. And they're all examples of the ecclesiastical and political guardianship that the genuine libertarian tradition seeks to dismantle and reconstruct from below, while also changing industry from a feudalistic to a democratic social order, one that's based on workers' control, community control, respects the dignity of the producer as a genuine person, not a tool in the hands of others, in accordance with a libertarian tradition that has deep roots and, like Marx's old mole, is always burrowing quite close to the surface and ready to spring forth. Thanks.
So for the discussion, I'd like to invite anybody who has a question to line up behind the microphones on either side, and please try to keep it concise. And as you do that, I'd like to start, if you don't mind. I just wonder if you could say something about the images that represent some of your first encounters with anarchism. I mean, I think for people who have gotten excited about these ideas through the Occupy movement, it was important to see it in practice somehow. I wonder what those images have been for you.
Well, I grew up in the 1930s. That's when I was a kid. It was a deep depression and plenty of suffering. And there were images that kind of stick in my mind. People coming to my parents were teachers, so we had some money, not rich, but got along. And in fact, the whole family of unemployed working class kind of converged around our house. We had at least something. But there were images of people coming to the door, trying to sell rags to try to get a piece of bread to survive. I remember riding with my mother on trolley cars, going past textile plants, this is Philadelphia, and watching women on strike being brutally beaten by security forces. My own extended family was mostly unemployed working class, and as I mentioned, very high culture. As the New Deal sort of began to have an impact, they were able to enjoy Shakespeare plays in the park, go to the Budapest String Quartet, to my unemployed seamstress aunts who were members of the ILGWU, Ladies Garment Workers Union, could get a couple of weeks in the countryside at a solidarity camp. That was life. A lot of it was Communist Party. We're not allowed to say anything nice about the Communist Party. That's a rule. And there were a lot of things wrong with it. I've mentioned some of them. But there were things that were right about it. Like one was that it overcame the amnesia that Nathan talked about. It was always there. People remembered. Somebody remembered how to turn the mimeograph machine or organize a demonstration. And you went from a civil rights demonstration to a labor organizing to something else. They had crazy international ideas, but that was kind of in the back of their minds. It wasn't what was really going on. The destruction of the Communist Party was quite important. Killed off the radical, continuing element that kept a lot of the left traditions going. You know the reasons. It was in the Cold War framework. That was all there. As far as the anarchists were concerned, the place I learned about that was by reading. When I was a kid, I'd go to visit my relatives, and as soon as I got old enough to get on the train, about 11 or 12 years old, I'd take the train to New York and stay with my relatives, but spend most of my time down on, if those of you know New York, Union Square used to be the place where the anarchist offices were. the Freie Arbeiterstimme, others. And lots of pamphlets, lots of interesting people, quite eager to talk to a young kid, so not hard to have discussions. And down below Union Square on 4th Avenue, not today, but then there were rows of small bookstores, a lot of them run by European emigres, many of them Spanish refugees, Spanish anarchist refugees, who were also quite eager to talk and had lots of pamphlets and real original documentary material. Actually, when I wrote about this 20 years later, I used mostly documentary material I had picked up as a young teenager. It wasn't available. A lot of it's available now. It wasn't then. And that was a pretty inspiring picture, I felt. The Spanish Revolution, at least I felt and feel, was a really inspiring moment, which I think is why it elicited such a vicious response from every corner of power. That's quite important to remember. Communists, fascists, liberal democracies, all combined on crushing this. This was something they couldn't tolerate. Then they could have a fight later about who picks up the spoils. Actually, there were anarchist proposals that I felt were not unreasonable. They're disparaged, of course, in the West, but for how to win the Civil War. It was anarchist thinkers like Camillo Berneri, who was murdered by the communists in May 1937, one of the leading anarchist thinkers. He proposed that he pointed out, I think, as it turned out quite correctly, that they'd never win a conventional war. For one reason, because the commitment to the war on the part of the population had seriously declined after the revolution was crushed. They had lost what they had fought for, and they didn't care very much who was going to pick up the spoils. He pointed out, and of course, the fascists were being directly supported by Hitler and Mussolini, and the West was not opposed to that. It's hard, you may forget now, but fascism had a pretty good image in the West in the late 30s. Mussolini was that admirable Italian gentleman, as Roosevelt called him. Hitler was regarded by the State Department as, in the late 30s, as a moderate who was holding off the forces of left and right, so we shouldn't be too critical of him. The United States had a consul in Berlin up until Pearl Harbor who was sending back dispatches saying you shouldn't be too hard on the Nazis. They're doing some things we don't like, but they're still kind of moderates. His name is George Kennan. You don't read that in the biographies. But that's not untypical of the period. Roosevelt, for example, there was a Neutrality Act. Theoretically, the United States was not supposed to allow support for either side in the Civil War. And Roosevelt was very bitter about any attempt by somebody to say, send a pistol to the Republic. He couldn't stop it by force, but he bitterly condemned it. On the other hand, the State Department couldn't notice what I was reading in the left-wing press at the time, and was later conceded 20 years later, that the United States had authorized the Texaco Oil Company, which was run by an outright Nazi, open Nazi, had authorized them to they had a contract to ship oil to the Republic. They switched it to shipping oil to the fascist forces, which is the one thing that Hitler and Mussolini couldn't provide. They couldn't find that. The left press could find it, but the State Department couldn't. Well, going back to Berneri, what he proposed was that in Spain itself, the popular forces should fight a guerrilla war. That's an old Spanish tradition. In fact, that's where guerrilla wars were initiated under Napoleon. Fight a guerrilla war in Spain itself, and in Morocco, call for support the Moroccan liberation forces that were trying to free themselves from French and British imperial and Spanish imperial control. That was the base of Franco's army. They were Moorish troops. coming from northern Africa. So his idea was fight a revolutionary war, support them in their efforts to overthrow imperialist control that he thought would erode the fascist armies, just as in Spain itself the popular forces were fighting, but until they were crushed. Well, that's if you read the scholarship on the matter up till today, that's kind of dismissed as a sort of a romantic joke, as the whole anarchist movement is. But I don't think it was. That was my initial exposure to it.
Hi, Professor Chomsky. This is an unimaginable honor. Thank you so much for doing this. I just wanted to, you touched briefly, you had this wonderful Shelley quote, and you touched briefly on your family's engagement with high culture. And I was wondering, or I was just going to ask you to reflect briefly on the contemporary state of high culture and serious art, and how important you think engagement with that, serious contemporary literature, music, cinema, whatever it is, how important it is in exploring the sort of the vanguard of political thought, and whether or not contemporary artists and contemporary audiences are rising to that challenge.
Well, I think it's very important, and I'm not the only one who thinks so. I think people with power think so. That's why famous Rivera mural wasn't allowed to be put in Rockefeller Center. And that's why if you go back to cinema, you say go back 60 years, early 50s, some of you'll remember. So in 1953, interesting year for cinema, there were two major films that came out, two films that came out on the labor movement. One, which was a huge box office success, ton of PR, advertising, and so on, featured Marlon Brando, was about a corrupt union leader and how the heroic, Joe with his lunchbox finally overcame the corrupt union leader, and at the end of the film throws him into the water and everybody cheers. So that was one. There was another film, a marvelous film called Salt of the Earth, a low-budget film, which was about a victorious strike led by a Hispanic woman. It was a really great film. If you can find it somewhere, you should look at it. No one ever heard of it. You could find it maybe in a small art theater in downtown New York somewhere. But that wasn't the kind of film that was going to get publicity. And that runs through consistently. And I think when people in power believe something firmly, it's worth paying attention to them. And I think they believe firmly that you should not have revolutionary, popular art in which people participate. Actually, that's one of the reasons, I think, for destroying the graffiti in the New York subways. That's considered a great achievement of Bloomberg. You don't have graffiti, popular art, all over the subways, because that's just too dangerous. It's part of the drug war, grotesque drug war, race war, murderers. A large part of it came from the fact that the Harlem Renaissance, black artists in Harlem, were playing jazz and smoking marijuana. So that had to be destroyed. That became the great criminal of the age. Mexicans were doing it too. This is pretty constant. So yeah, I think it's really important.
Noam, what is preventing people, if anything, from organizing themselves into worker-controlled cooperatives? You alluded to co-ops. And if not much is preventing them from doing so, to what do you attribute their relative lack of popularity? And the related question would be, what could union-controlled pensions, for example, be doing if the problem is capital, for example? Why aren't more entities like putatively worker-controlled pensions investing the capital they have some control over in supporting these kinds of worker-controlled alternatives?
Well, first of all, pensions are not in the hands of working people. The unions are not popular democracies. Pensions are in the hands of bureaucrats and money managers. And they're not about to hand over power to popular organizations. Actually, it's not entirely true. There are some interesting initiatives. I don't know if they're going to get anywhere, but they're interesting. United Steelworkers, which is one of the more progressive unions, has recently made some tentative arrangements with Mondragon in the Basque Country, this huge and worker-owned industrial banking, housing, school, educational cooperative. That could get somewhere. And I mentioned Garo Perovitz's work. He's discussed very well and participates in the spread of worker-owned enterprises in mostly northern Ohio, the old Rust Belt. They have a kind of an interesting history, which relates very much to this. Back in 1977, at the beginning of the concerted effort to destroy industrial production in the United States and sort of beginning of the kind of neoliberal assault on the population we've been through in the past generation, U.S. Steel decided to close its main steel plants in Youngstown, Ohio. It was a steel town, like other working-class towns like Detroit. It had actually been built by the working classes. It was their town. They didn't get the profit because they were tools, but they built it. They wanted to keep it. U.S. Steel wanted to sell it, to close it down, and the union offered to buy it. They had community support. They even had some support of, I think it was a Republican governor. Just let the workers buy the plant and keep running it. Well, U.S. Steel didn't want that. In fact, this is pretty consistent. I mentioned Dave Ellerman before. He's one who's written about it and worked on it. Very commonly around here, too, eastern Massachusetts, when workers decide to try to take over an enterprise which may be perfectly profitable, but not profitable enough for the multinational who runs it. Maybe they don't want to keep it in their books. When they try to buy it, which would be a good deal for the multinational, they refuse to sell it for class reasons. They have class interests. They do not want to see the spread of popular democratic organizations for perfectly obvious reasons. This just happened in, I'll come back to Youngstown in a minute, but it just happened a couple of years ago right here in Taunton. There was a small but quite successful manufacturing plant which made specialized parts for aircraft, doing pretty well, but the multinational didn't want to bother with it, so they were going to close it down. The union, UE in this case, tried to buy it. The multinationals usually refused to sell it, and there wasn't enough support, popular support, to push it through. If there had been an Occupy movement at that time, I think that's something they might have pushed through. Actually, on a much larger scale, a couple of years ago, Obama virtually nationalized the auto industry. Not entirely, but virtually. There were a couple of options. One option was to restructure it, use taxpayer funding, hand it back to the original owners or other people just like them, maybe a different face, but bankers, CEOs, and so on, and then have it continue to do what it had been doing before, building cars. That's what they chose. There was another option. Hand it over to the workforce, have them build what's needed in the country, which is not more cars for traffic jams, but high-speed mass transportation. The United States is very backward in the world in this respect. I mean, you can take a high-speed train from Beijing to Kazakhstan, but try to take a train from Boston to New York. It's about as slow as it was 60 years ago. This is really backward. The country needs it. And the former auto industry could have been handed over to the workforce and maybe given some support, probably less than the auto industry got, to do this. But that wasn't an option. Suppose there had been a large-scale Occupy movement, significant. It was significant, but broader, expanded. Well, I think that could have been pushed through. It takes popular consciousness. But going back to Youngstown, the case went to court in 1977. The union lost, the workers lost, and it was the steel mills were destroyed. But they didn't give up. They didn't just say, okay, we'll starve to death or go somewhere else. They began to organize small worker-owned enterprises. And they've been spreading around the Cleveland area, and good Youngstown, good bit of northern Ohio, into other areas. So it is taking place. But, you know, it's happening elsewhere, too. In northern Mexico, there are quite successful worker-owned plants. It's not easy because, you know, the banks don't like to give them capital, and the government doesn't like them and won't support them, again, for class reasons. But if there's sufficient popular support, these things can develop. And it's not easy. You know, it's hard work, and the people who organize usually suffer for it. But that's typical of almost everything. The civil rights movement, you know, practically any movement that has ever gotten anywhere, the people up front usually take it in the chin. You know, it's hard, and people have to be willing to endure and for a longer-term gain, and that's not easy, but it can happen, and it does.
Hi, I'm just curious if you could address the role of surveillance technologies and increasingly the militarization of police as far as moving forward in radical thought today and in the future, kind of what you see where that is now.
Well, I think there are two things to bear in mind about that. The first thing is that the phenomenon itself shouldn't be at all surprising. The second is that the scale, at least to me, is kind of surprising. I hadn't really expected that scale. But the phenomenon is normal. And it's, again, as American as apple pie. Now, you can go back a century. Take, say, the Philippine War early in the 19th century, 20th century. It was a vicious war. The U.S. conquered the Philippines, killed a couple 100,000 people. It was a major popular nationalist movement. After the military victory, it had to be suppressed and controlled. And a huge pacification campaign was initiated using the highest technology of the day for surveillance, subversion, breaking up groups, building up hostilities, all kinds of things. Very sophisticated. It was very quickly transferred home. It was used by Woodrow Wilson in the Red Scare, the worst repression in American history, and developed further since. It's had a lethal effect on the Philippines. People mourn the typhoon that killed tens of thousands of people. That doesn't happen in functioning societies. It's very striking in the Caribbean. When a tropical storm goes through the Caribbean, in Haiti, one of the major victims of imperial violence, it's vicious. Right next door in Cuba, 3 people die. Some buildings are knocked over. Same storm. Depends on the society. Well, the Philippines is a society that we created, have maintained. It's the one part of Southeast Asia that hasn't taken part in the so-called Asian miracle, not one of the Asian tigers. There's a reason for that, good reason. But these techniques, you can be confident that any state or a commercial enterprise, any system of power, is going to use whatever technology is available to try to control and dominate its, what amounts to its major enemy, namely the population. That's what power systems are going to do. The scale of what was revealed, I think, was a little surprising, but it actually shouldn't be. And there's more to come. Those of you who read technical journals, like, say, the MIT Technology Review, should know what's coming. So, for example, just in the Tech Review recently, there have been articles on things like there and elsewhere on the hardware in computers, which is now being designed. They blame China, but of course that means it's being done 10 times as much here, to put in components in the hardware that will enable the manufacturer to record every keystroke, everything that's happening on your computer. American businesses are worried because if they have Chinese computers, they'll be picking it up at the People's Liberation Army. But they don't point out that the American systems are doubtless much more advanced than doing the same thing. Robotics is a field that's been worked on pretty hard for many years here too. And one of the goals, quite explicit, nothing secret, is to develop fly-sized drones, tiny robots, which can, get on the ceiling of your living room and carry out constant surveillance. And drones tend to go from surveillance to lethal capacities very quickly. So we can expect that pretty soon. These are things that are in development. Any system of power is going to use them. And pretty strikingly, jihadis are going to use them. One of the things we're doing right now is creating perfect technology for terrorist attacks. It's not a secret. You take a look at drone technology. Right by today already, it's claimed that for $300 you can purchase a small drone online. Now that's improving very fast. And for terrorist activities, it's just perfect. If you want to get a picture of it, there's an article in this month's leading journal of foreign affairs in Britain, the Royal Institute Journal of International Affairs, describing how we are rapidly creating the technology to permit massive terrorist attacks on ourselves. That's also typical. Power systems seek short-term power and domination. They are not concerned with security. It's contrary to academic dogma. You can easily show that. They're interested in power, domination, the welfare of their primary domestic constituencies, which are wealth, concentrated wealth. And if there's a disaster in the long term, it's not their business. You can show that. It's obvious with environmental issues. It's the same with nuclear weapons. Same right now with drone technology. So sure, this stuff is going to go on unless we stop it. You can stop it too. It doesn't have to go on.
Can you offer a critique of startup culture and entrepreneurship, which offers many of the seeming characteristics of autonomy, but isn't so?
Seeming characteristics. Startup culture is, it's okay. People like their apps and so on, but it's based very heavily on state subsidy. It's kind of a narrow form of entrepreneurship. So take, for example, the Silicon Valley culture. What are they using? Well, they're using computers, the internet, microelectronics, and so on and so forth, almost all developed in the state sector for decades before it's handed over to private power for commercialization and application. So yeah, there's initiative there, and people are having fun and doing maybe interesting things, but relying very heavily on the background state subsidy, which takes many forms. Actually, everyone at MIT ought to know it. It's paid our salaries for years. For decades, computers and the internet and the whole basis of the IT culture were being developed right here in similar places in RLE and so on. Finally, after decades, it was handed over to Bill Gates and Steve Jobs to market and commercialize and make profit and make little things that you carry around with you. So it's a kind of it has entrepreneurial aspects, but it's parasitic on much more fundamental development. The really hard work, the hard research and development, the creative work is quite substantially in the state sector. Incidentally, it's not just subsidy. There are many other devices of taxpayer support for private enterprise. One of the main ones is procurement. So, for example, in the early 60s, IBM through the 50s had learned, mostly in government laboratories and places like this, had learned to switch from punch cards to digital computers, and they built the world's biggest computer in the early 60s, stretch computer, fastest computer. But it was much too expensive for business, so the government bought it. That's the purchaser of last resort, and I think it went to Los Alamos. And that goes on all the time. Procurement's a major form of public subsidy to private enterprise. And there are many other ways. That's one of the reasons why private capital does not want markets. They want markets for other people, but not for themselves. For themselves, they want a nanny state, powerful nanny state that will support them. What the significance of the entrepreneurial culture is, you can judge. I'm not overwhelmed by the fact that there's thousands of new apps coming every day. I think there are more important things. Yeah.
So I had a question about how you reconcile the emancipatory tradition of anarchism to the kind of abstractness of the ideology itself around authority and power and coercion. Because it could be argued, for example, that the federal government intervened in the South during the Civil War was coercive to the Confederate States. We know that, like, it was the Civil War was a revolution of slaves against slavery, and the federal government ended up intervening much later. But that could be argued that was a form of authority. Because so that how do you actually navigate that with, say, for example, the Marxist kind of definition, which would be between labor and capital, for example. Do you see that as something that is maybe different from or offers a sort of a different perspective from anarchism? Because I think that could account for the reason why, for example, there are such things as anarcho-capitalism. It can be argued that, you know, several different ways that the state is intervening on my ability to pay my workers a low wage or whatnot.
I'm not sure. I didn't understand exactly.
The question of, so my question is, authority itself is a really abstract term. Authority of whom, I feel like, is...
I don't think there's anything abstract about authority. We all live with it all the time. I mean, that's true if you're a worker, namely a wage slave, as workers understood. It's true if you're until very recently, for most women, it's been obvious, nothing abstract about it. Women didn't even have legal rights in the United States until pretty recently.
Oh, my question is, like, do workers have the authority, for example, to take over a factory?
Do they have the authority? Yeah, why not?
That's what I mean, authority
they
to...
built the plant, they made the product, so they do the work. Why should they be tools rented by some banker somewhere else? I mean, that's the way our institutional structure happens to be formulated, but doesn't mean it's legitimate. I mean, when you talk about authority, you're asking questions about legitimacy. Do people have the right to run their own lives? Or do they have to be sort of tools in the hands of foreign masters? Well, you know, that's a question of legitimacy, not authority. Well, you mentioned the Civil War, and there's ample evidence by now that there was very significant slave initiative in the Civil War. Now, there's more to say about that, a lot more. So take the American Revolution. To a large extent, that was a revolution carried out in order to maintain slavery. You look back at the history. In around 1770, in Britain, the legal system was beginning to undertake strong condemnations of slavery. There was one famous case, Somerset case, in 1772, where slave owners from the United States brought their slaves with them to England. One of them escaped. There was an effort his owner wanted him back. It's my property. And it went to court and went to Lord Mansfield, the famous jurist, who ruled that slavery is so odious, that was the term that he used, that it cannot be tolerated on English soil. Crucially, it could be tolerated in the colonies, but that's another story, but not on English soil. And the United States was, the founders of the country were almost all slave owners. And they could see the handwriting on the wall. If the colonies remained under British rule, probably these laws would apply here and they'd lose their property. And that was surely a significant element in the revolution. And it runs right to the present. I mean, right to this moment, the Civil War is still being fought. Simply take a look at the electoral maps, say the map of the election in 2012, red states and blue states. It's almost identical to the Civil War. It's the Confederacy, which now call themselves Republicans, shifted names, and the rest, which was the North. A large part of the motivation behind the effort to shut down the government is just revenge. We want to shut down Washington and win this war finally. The United States never developed class parties like labor parties. They didn't amount to much, but at least they were something. But the U.S. never had them. It's always had sectional parties. And it's a reflection of the Civil War, which has never ended. It also hasn't ended in the prisons and elsewhere. It's a very deeply rooted thing in the society and hard to extirpate. Yeah.
Well, I hope you all join me in thanking Noam Chomsky once more. Thank you all so much for coming. There are books available in the back. Thank you also for the questions.